Imagine standing in a colonial American town in 1776. The revolution is in full swing, patriots are marching, drums are beating, and everyone around you is fired up about liberty and independence. Now imagine that you disagree. Imagine that you think the whole thing is a catastrophic mistake. Imagine that you believe these men, with their muskets and their pamphlets, are not heroes, but dangerous radicals, dragging an entire civilization toward ruin. Imagine that you say this out loud. What happens next? Your neighbors burn your house down. A mob tars and feathers you. Your property gets confiscated. Your children get harassed in the streets. And you have done nothing wrong except hold a political opinion. Welcome to the American Revolution, the side nobody talks about. Here is the fact that will shatter everything you think you know about this period. 1/3 of all American colonists actively opposed the revolution. Not 1%, not a fringe minority, 1/3. That is roughly 500,000 people who looked at George Washington and his Continental Army and thought, no, this is wrong. These people had names, they had families, they had reasons. And history buried them so completely that most Americans today cannot name a single one. We are about to fix that. This is not the story you were taught in school. This is not the clean narrative of brave colonists rising up against a tyrannical king. That story is real, but it is only half the picture. The other half involves hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children who made a different choice, paid an unimaginable price for it, and were then erased from the national memory as thoroughly as if they had never existed. By the end of this, you will never look at the American founding the same way again, because what happened to the Loyalists is one of the darkest, most uncomfortable, and most fascinating chapters in all of American history. So who were these people? That is the first question, and the answer will surprise you. When most people hear the word Loyalist, they picture some stuffy British aristocrat who just happened to be living in the colonies, a wig-wearing snob who is too attached to his tea and his social status to embrace freedom. That image is wrong, almost completely wrong. The Loyalists were not some alien group imported from England. They were Americans, born and raised in the colonies. Many of them were farmers, merchants, lawyers, and craftsmen. They went to the same churches as the Patriots. They spoke the same language. They lived on the same streets. The only difference was what they believed about the future of their country, and their reasons for staying loyal to the crown were far more complex than simple cowardice or snobbery. Take a man like Joseph Galloway, born in Maryland, raised in Pennsylvania, one of the most respected lawyers and politicians in the entire continent. Galloway was not some lackey of the British Empire. He was a genuine American thinker who had spent decades trying to reform the colonial relationship with Britain from the inside. He proposed a plan to the Continental Congress in 1774 that would have given the colonies their own parliament with real legislative power while keeping them connected to the British Empire as equal partners. Think about that. Galloway was trying to invent something like what Canada eventually became, and Congress rejected his plan. And then they burned him in effigy. Galloway was tall, sharp-eyed, with a kind of face that projected cold intelligence even in a room full of brilliant men. He dressed with careful precision, not out of vanity, but because he believed that how you presented yourself reflected the seriousness of your ideas. He had spent his entire adult life arguing that reason and law were more powerful than passion and gunpowder. And when the revolution came, and passion and gunpowder won the argument, he was devastated. Not just politically, personally. His own wife, Grace, a formidable woman in her own right, ended up on opposite sides of the conflict from him in the most literal sense possible. Grace Galloway stayed in Philadelphia and fought a remarkable legal battle to keep her property when the Patriot government tried to confiscate it. Joseph fled to New York with the British. They never lived together again. The revolution did not just divide a nation, it shredded families. And the Galloway story was not unique. It was everywhere. The revolution tore through families like a wildfire. Benjamin Franklin, the great patriot, the founding father, the genius of the age, had a son, William Franklin. And William Franklin was not just a loyalist, he was the royal governor of New Jersey. Father and son on opposite sides. They argued, they corresponded with increasing bitterness, and eventually they stopped talking entirely. William was arrested by Patriot forces, imprisoned for 2 years in terrible conditions, and eventually exiled to England. He and his father met one final time in Southampton in 1785. The meeting was cold, uncomfortable, and brief. Benjamin Franklin died in 1790. He left William almost nothing in his will. William outlived his father by nearly 23 years, living in London, never returning to America. Just think about what that meant. The son of the most famous American in the world, exiled from the country his father helped create. Why does this matter so much? Why should we care about the Loyalists 250 years later? Here is why. Because the way a society treats its dissenters tells you everything about what that society actually values. The American founding generation talked endlessly about liberty, rights, and freedom of conscience. They wrote brilliant documents about the natural rights of man. And then they systematically destroyed the lives of people who disagreed with them. Not people who committed crimes, not people who took up arms against their neighbors, though some did, but ordinary people who held a different political opinion. That tension between the ideals and the reality is at the heart of American history, and understanding the Loyalists forces you to sit with that tension and take it seriously. Let us talk about who the Loyalists actually were, because the demographics are genuinely surprising. The stereotype of the wealthy Tory protecting his estates is real, but it only captures a small part of the picture. Yes, many of the richest merchants and landowners in the colonies became Loyalists, particularly in New York, South Carolina, and Georgia. They had too much to lose from revolution and too much to gain from continued British protection. But alongside them, you find some of the most unexpected groups imaginable. Enslaved Black Americans, for example, tens of thousands of them. The British military promised freedom to any enslaved person who escaped a Patriot master and joined British lines. And they came, by the thousands. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued his famous proclamation in 1775, and within weeks, hundreds of enslaved people were slipping away from plantations in the night to reach British ships. Were these people Loyalists in any ideological sense? Of course not. They did not care about the British Empire. They cared about freedom. And they looked at the situation with clear eyes and understood that the British offer, however cynical and limited it might be, was the only offer on the table. Then there were the Native American nations. Most of the major tribal confederacies in the eastern part of the continent sided with the British, or at least tried to remain neutral while leaning toward the crown. This was not a mystery to anyone who understood the situation. The Patriots wanted land. They had always wanted land. Every peace treaty, every boundary agreement with native nations had been pushed and violated by colonial settlers expanding westward. The British government, by contrast, had issued the Proclamation of 1763, which explicitly forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically to protect native territories. From the perspective of the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Creek, and dozens of other nations, the revolution was not a struggle for liberty. It was a struggle about who would take their land fastest, and they chose accordingly. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most sophisticated political systems in the entire world, was torn apart by the revolution. The 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee had maintained their unity and their political independence for generations. The revolution broke them. The Oneida and the Tuscarora sided with the Patriots. The Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca sided with the British. And these nations, which had been allies and family for centuries, fought each other. The Battle of Oriskany in 1777 was essentially an Iroquois civil war, with warriors on both sides killing men they had known their entire lives. The Confederacy never recovered. After the war, The Americans pushed all 6 nations off most of their lands, regardless of which side they had chosen. If you were Oneida and had fought for the Patriots, you got a slightly better deal, but not by much. The revolution's promise of liberty extended to a very specific group of people, and the Iroquois were not on the list. Joseph Brant understood this better than almost anyone. Thayendanegea, known to the British and Americans as Joseph Brant, was a Mohawk war chief and one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire revolutionary period. He was educated at a colonial school, spoke perfect English, had traveled to London twice, been received at the court of King George, and had his portrait painted by one of the leading artists of the age. He was sophisticated, bilingual, politically brilliant, and absolutely ferocious in battle. Brant led Loyalist and Mohawk raids on Patriot settlements throughout the Mohawk Valley and western frontier, most famously at Cherry Valley and Wyoming Valley in 1778. These raids were brutal, and Patriot propaganda painted Brant as a monster, a savage butcher. The reality was more complicated. Brant himself repeatedly tried to prevent the killing of civilians, though he did not always succeed. And his goal was not wanton destruction. It was strategic. He was fighting for the survival of his people, and he understood that the only way to ensure that survival was to make sure Britain won the war. Brant was physically imposing, broad-shouldered, with intense dark eyes that people described as simultaneously warm and dangerous. He wore both European clothing and traditional Mohawk dress, depending on the occasion, and he moved between both worlds with a fluency that impressed and unsettled people in equal measure. He spoke in metaphors, drawn from the natural world when addressing his own people, and in precise legal language when dealing with British officials. He translated the Bible into Mohawk. He was, by any standard, an exceptional human being. And after the Revolution, when Britain signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and simply handed over Mohawk lands to the new United States without consulting their allies, or even mentioning the native nations in the treaty, Brant was furious. He called it a betrayal. He was right. Britain had been perfectly willing to use the Mohawk as soldiers, as raiders, as a strategic asset, and then they signed them away in a peace deal without a second thought. Now let us get to something that most American history courses skip over almost entirely: the violence. Not the organized violence of battles and campaigns, but the intimate, personal, neighbor-against-neighbor violence that made the Revolution one of the bloodiest civil conflicts in early American history. Because that is what it was. People call it the Revolutionary War, as if it were a clean foreign conflict between America and Britain, but in many colonies, it was a civil war, with Americans killing Americans, burning farms, executing prisoners, and settling old scores under the cover of political violence. South Carolina was perhaps the worst. The interior of that colony, the backcountry, was a war zone of extraordinary brutality from about 1778 onward. Loyalist and Patriot militias raided each other's farms, hanged prisoners, and destroyed crops and livestock with deliberate efficiency, designed to starve their enemies. A British officer named Bannister Tarleton, young, reckless, and aggressively ambitious, became notorious after the Battle of Waxhaws in May of 1780, where his cavalry rode down surrendering Patriot soldiers and killed them. Patriots called it a massacre. Tarleton called it a battle. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but the episode became a rallying cry. Tarleton's quarter became a Patriot battle cry, meaning no mercy, and the cycle of atrocity and revenge spiraled upward. Villages burned, men were shot in front of their families, women were assaulted, livestock was slaughtered. It was not glorious, it was not noble, it was what civil wars actually look like. And the Loyalists in South Carolina had particular reasons for their choices. Many of them were Scots-Irish settlers who had immigrated to the backcountry relatively recently and had only just established themselves on land. For them, the Patriot leadership, dominated by wealthy, coastal, English-descended plantation owners, represented not liberation, but a new form of domination. Why would a Scots-Irish farmer in the Carolina backcountry die for the political ambitions of Charleston merchants and Virginia planters? At least, the British government had legal structures and courts that theoretically protected small landowners. The Patriot Cause, as it actually existed in South Carolina, was partly a vehicle for the elite coastal gentry to consolidate their control over the entire colony. Some of the backcountry loyalists understood this perfectly clearly and resented it deeply. Flora MacDonald was perhaps the most famous loyalist woman in America, and her story is almost too dramatic to be real. She was already a legend before she set foot on American soil. A Scottish heroine who had helped Bonnie Prince Charlie escape after the disastrous Battle of Culloden in 1746, she had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, then released, then celebrated across the British Isles as a romantic figure of loyalty and courage. She emigrated to North Carolina in 1774 with her husband, Alan MacDonald, and hundreds of other Scottish Highlanders. When the Revolution came, she helped recruit Highland Scots to fight for the crown. The Highlanders, many of whom had experienced brutal British suppression after Culloden, might have been expected to side with the rebels against royal authority, but their experience had taught them something different. They had seen what uncontrolled rebellion looked like. They had seen their culture and their world destroyed in its aftermath. They wanted stability, not another catastrophe. Flora MacDonald was small, fierce, and utterly fearless. Contemporary descriptions paint her as someone who walked into rooms and immediately commanded attention, not through beauty or charm, though she had both, but through a quality of absolute certainty. She had already done the impossible once. She carried herself like someone who had nothing left to prove. When the Highland Loyalists were defeated at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in February of 1776, barely 2 months after Lexington and Concord, her husband was captured. Flora herself escaped immediate imprisonment, but was effectively ruined. Her property was confiscated, her family was scattered. She eventually returned to Scotland in 1778, broken and impoverished. She had crossed an ocean to build a new life, and the Revolution took everything. She died in Scotland in 1790. Her obituary described her as a woman of uncommon personal courage. The American Republic that had destroyed her barely noticed. Here is where we need to stop and think carefully about something that gets almost no attention in popular history. The legal machinery that the Patriots built to suppress loyalism was not a temporary emergency measure. It was a systematic, organized, and extraordinarily effective apparatus of dispossession. Every single one of the 13 new American states passed laws specifically targeting loyalists. These laws did not just punish people for fighting against the Revolution, they punished people for holding opinions. In many states, refusing to swear an oath of loyalty to the new government was sufficient grounds for having your property confiscated. In some states, even speaking favorably about the British government was a crime. The Test Acts, as many of these laws were called, required citizens to actively declare their allegiance or face consequences. This was not liberty. This was compelled ideological conformity enforced by the threat of ruin. Think about what this meant in practice. A man who had simply stayed quiet during the war, who had neither fought for the crown nor actively aided the British, who had just tried to keep his head down and protect his family, could still find himself in front of a Patriot committee being asked to swear oaths and explain his conduct. And if the committee decided it did not like his answers, or if one of his neighbors had a grudge against him and chose this moment to settle it, he could lose his farm, his business, his home. New York alone confiscated property worth hundreds of millions of dollars in modern terms. Massachusetts did the same, Virginia, Pennsylvania. The scale of the dispossession was staggering, and much of the confiscated property was not used for any public purpose. It was redistributed to patriots, often at sweetheart prices. The Revolution was a genuine ideological struggle. It was also, for many of its participants, a spectacular opportunity to get rich at the expense of their political enemies. The commissioners of forfeited estates in South Carolina sold confiscated Loyalist property at public auction. Patriots bought plantations, houses, tools, furniture, livestock, and everything else their loyalist neighbors had spent lifetimes building. Some of these buyers were acting in good faith and genuinely believed the loyalists deserved to lose their property. Others knew perfectly well that the men whose estates they were purchasing had committed no real crime. Opportunism dressed in the language of patriotism. This is not a comfortable observation, but it is an honest one. Revolutions create winners and losers, and the material incentives for identifying your neighbor as an enemy were very real. Benjamin Thompson was one of the most bizarre and brilliant loyalists of the entire war, and his story reads like something out of a fever dream. Born in Massachusetts in 1753, Thompson was a self-educated scientific genius who taught himself advanced physics, chemistry, and military engineering from books he borrowed and devoured. He was also spectacularly handsome, charming, and extraordinarily ambitious. He married a wealthy widow, moved in elite circles, and became a spy for the British before the revolution had even properly started. When war broke out, he fled to London, became a senior official in the British War Office, made himself indispensable to half the government, went back to America to command a loyalist regiment, went back to London again, then moved to Bavaria, where he reorganized the Bavarian army, fed the poor of Munich using a soup kitchen system he invented, redesigned military uniforms, invented a new kind of fireplace, and was eventually made a Count of the Holy Roman Empire. Count Rumford. He discovered a fundamental principle of thermodynamics. His work on the relationship between mechanical work and heat laid important groundwork for the development of the concept of energy. One of the most important scientific discoveries of the 18th century came from an American loyalist who fled his country and reinvented himself 3 times in 3 different countries. What does that tell you about what the revolution threw away? But Thompson's story, extraordinary as it is, should not distract us from the far less glamorous reality of what happened to the majority of loyalists. Most of them did not reinvent themselves as Bavarian counts or scientific geniuses. Most of them faced a much grimmer choice. After 1783, when the Treaty of Paris made American independence official and permanent, somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 loyalists went into exile. They left. They had to. Staying meant living under a government that had labeled them traitors, surrounded by neighbors who resented or despised them, in communities where their children would grow up carrying the stigma of their family's political choices. So they packed what they could carry, and they left. Most went to Canada. The maritime provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick received floods of loyalist refugees beginning in 1783. The city of St. John was effectively founded by loyalist exiles. Shelburne, Nova Scotia, briefly became one of the largest cities in all of North America as thousands of refugees arrived within months of the treaty.
Yes, sir. Moving the fish now.
Then the economy collapsed. Supplies ran short, the land proved difficult to farm, and Shelburne shrank back almost to nothing within a few years. The loyalists who came to Canada brought with them skills, education, professional experience, and a fierce sense of grievance. They built institutions, they founded colleges, they established legal traditions, they helped shape Canadian society in ways that still echo today, and they never forgave what had been done to them. The black loyalists who came to Nova Scotia faced a particularly brutal experience. About 3,500 of them arrived in 1783, free people who had accepted British promises of liberty and fought or worked for the Crown during the war. They were given land, or rather, they were promised land. The actual land grants they received were smaller than promised, less fertile than promised, and more slowly delivered than promised. White loyalists received better land, more land, and faster service. The racism was systematic and explicit. Black loyalists in Nova Scotia faced discrimination in land allocation, in legal proceedings, in employment, in every dimension of their lives. By 1792, roughly 1,200 of them had given up on Nova Scotia entirely. They accepted an offer from a British abolitionist organization and emigrated to Sierra Leone in West Africa, founding the colony of Freetown. Think about that trajectory. Enslaved in America, freed by the British in exchange for service during the war, exiled to Nova Scotia, abandoned and discriminated against there, finally sailing to Africa to start yet again. These were people of extraordinary resilience, and their story is almost completely absent from standard American historical narratives. Now we come to the moment that changes everything, the moment that forces us to ask the hardest question of all. Were the Loyalists wrong? Not morally wrong about slavery or about native rights, though many of them were just as complicit in those injustices as the Patriots, but were they wrong in their assessment of the situation? Were they wrong to believe that the revolution was a dangerous gamble that would end badly? Think about this carefully. The Loyalists made a prediction. They predicted that breaking with Britain would lead to chaos, instability, mob rule, and eventually tyranny. They looked at what had happened in every previous republic in history, and they said, "This does not end well." And what happened? Well, the American Revolution did end well, by most measures. The Republic survived. The Constitution worked, more or less. The country expanded and prospered. The Loyalists were wrong in the long run. But were they irrational to be worried? Were their fears unreasonable given what they knew at the time? The French Revolution happened just a few years later, and it did exactly what the American Loyalists had feared the American Revolution would do. It produced the terror. It produced military dictatorship. It produced Napoleon. The American experiment was the exception in revolutionary history, not the rule. And the Loyalists, looking at history as it had actually unfolded, had every reason to be skeptical that this particular revolution would be any different. Thomas Hutchinson understood this better than anyone. He was the last civilian royal governor of Massachusetts, a Boston-born, Harvard-educated, lifelong public servant who had spent 30 years working for the good of the colony he loved. He was not a villain. He was not corrupt. He was not even particularly pro-British in any personal sense. He was simply someone who believed that the British constitutional system, however imperfect, was the best framework available for protecting the liberties of Massachusetts citizens. He thought the Stamp Act was stupid and counterproductive, and he said so, in private, to his superiors. He thought most of the British colonial policies of the 1760s were poorly conceived, but he also believed that destroying the connection with Britain was a catastrophic overreaction to manageable problems. He said so, publicly, and it destroyed him. Hutchinson was tall and angular, with sharp features and a manner that people who liked him called precise and people who hated him called cold. He had written a 3-volume history of Massachusetts that remains one of the finest works of colonial American historiography ever produced. He was a genuinely great man in the older sense of that word, someone whose intellectual contributions outlasted the political controversies that surrounded him. But in Boston in the 1770s, being a genuinely great man was not enough if you were on the wrong side. His house had already been destroyed by a mob in 1765 during the Stamp Act riots, and the loss of his library and irreplaceable historical documents from that attack caused him genuine anguish for the rest of his life. He went into exile in England in 1774, expecting to return soon, never believing the situation was as serious as the radicals claimed. He died in London in 1780 without ever going home. He spent his final years writing his history, revising his memoirs, and trying to understand what had gone wrong. He never could. He simply could not comprehend how a society he had served his entire life could turn on him so completely for believing what he had always believed, openly and honestly, without malice toward anyone. Now here is the twist that nobody sees coming. The Americans who stayed. Not every loyalist went into exile. Many stayed in the new United States, kept their heads down, swore whatever oaths were required, and gradually, quietly, were reabsorbed into American society. And something remarkable happened. Within a generation, many of their families became as patriotically American as anyone else. Their children grew up as Americans. Their grandchildren fought in American wars. The Loyalist heritage was suppressed, denied, or simply forgotten. The erasure was not just political, it was psychological. Families stopped talking about it. The grandfather who had supported the crown became the embarrassing ancestor nobody mentioned. The story got edited out of family memory, just as thoroughly as it got edited out of national memory. But here is the deepest irony of all. Many of the things the Loyalists stood for, many of the political instincts they represented, ended up shaping the American system anyway. The strong federal government that the Constitution established after 1787, the system of courts, the protections for property rights, the skepticism of pure democracy and mob rule, the insistence on stability and order, these were all positions that Loyalists had advocated. The Federalists, the party of Washington and Hamilton and Adams, adopted many positions that would have been recognizable to moderate Loyalists of the 1770s. Hamilton himself was an immigrant who had no particular emotional attachment to colonial American political culture, and he designed the American financial and governmental system along lines that would not have been entirely alien to someone like Joseph Galloway or Thomas Hutchinson. History is stranger than any story we tell about it. So what do we owe the Loyalists? Not an endorsement of their choices, not a revision of the Revolution as something other than what it was, but honesty. We owe them honesty. We owe them the acknowledgement that they existed, that they were numerous, that their reasons were real, and that what happened to them was not justice in any meaningful sense. The confiscation of their property without trial, the mob violence, the exile, the erasure from national memory, these were not the acts of a perfectly principled society. They were the acts of people at war, doing what people at war do, which is to say, they were the acts of human beings, complicated and imperfect, and sometimes frightening, just like all of us. The story of the Loyalists does not make the American Revolution less important or less remarkable. The founding of the United States was a genuine achievement of political thought and human courage, but it was not clean. It was not universally just. It was not experienced the same way by everyone who lived through it. 1/3 of American colonists looked at it and said no, and we have spent 2.5 centuries pretending those people did not exist. Maybe it is time to stop pretending. Think about what it means for a society to erase the memory of its dissenters. What does it say about the stories we tell ourselves? Every nation has a founding myth, a story it tells about how it came to be and why it deserves to exist. Those myths are powerful and necessary, but they are also always incomplete. The American founding myth is one of the most powerful in human history, and the Loyalists are the part of the story that the myth requires us to forget. Because if we remember them, if we take them seriously, if we acknowledge that they had real reasons and that they were treated with real brutality, then the story gets more complicated, and complicated stories are harder to celebrate, but they are more true, and in the end, truth is worth more than celebration. Joseph Brant lived until 1807, spending his final decades in Ontario, working tirelessly but unsuccessfully to secure the rights of his people and other native nations. He never stopped arguing, writing, appealing to British officials, insisting that the Crown honor the promises it had made to its native allies. He was ignored, patronized, and dismissed. His people were pushed onto increasingly small reserves. The British Empire, for which the Mohawk had sacrificed so much, treated them as an inconvenience. William Franklin died in London in 1813, never having returned to America. He left memoirs, but no children who survived him. The line ended. Joseph Galloway died in England in 1803, having spent his final years writing polemics about the Revolution and the incompetence of British military leadership, bitter and unreconciled to the end. Thomas Hutchinson's History of Massachusetts is still read today by scholars who recognize it as a masterpiece of early American historical writing. His name is not on any American monument. Flora MacDonald is celebrated in Scotland and among Scottish Americans but primarily as the woman who saved Bonnie Prince Charlie, not as the woman who tried and failed to keep the Highland Scots loyal to Britain in North Carolina. Her American story is a footnote. Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, is remembered in the history of science, and not much else. His portrait hangs in a Bavarian museum. There is a small historical marker in Massachusetts, near where he was born. The marker does not mention that he was a spy and a loyalist. It focuses on the physics. Some erasures are very polite. But here is the question that should haunt us. If the loyalists had won, if somehow the revolution had been suppressed or had failed, what would America look like today? Would it look like Canada? An independent nation that gradually, peacefully achieved sovereignty through negotiation and constitutional evolution? Or would it look like something worse, a permanently subordinate colony bled dry by imperial extraction? We cannot know. History does not offer replays. What we do know is that the people who asked that question at the time, the people who argued for a different path, were not fools or cowards. They were human beings making impossible choices in circumstances none of us have ever had to face, and they paid for those choices with everything they had. So here is what you should take away from all of this. The next time someone tells you the American Revolution was a straightforward story of freedom versus tyranny, a clean battle between liberty and oppression, ask them about Joseph Galloway's plan for colonial partnership. Ask them about the black loyalists who sailed to Sierra Leone. Ask them about the Iroquois Confederacy that was torn apart and then betrayed by both sides. Ask them about the 60,000 people who went into exile rather than live under the new republic. Ask them about the thousands whose property was confiscated, whose houses were burned, whose lives were destroyed, not for fighting against the revolution, but for having the wrong opinion. The revolution was real. The liberty was real. The achievement was real. And so was all of this. History is not a simple story. It never is. That is what makes it endlessly worth telling. The Loyalists ask us a question that goes far beyond the 18th century. They ask us, what do we do with the people who disagree? What do we do with the minority that says no? Do we erase them? Destroy them? Drive them away? Or do we find a way to include them in the story, even the story of their own defeat? America has never fully answered that question. It has been asked again and again throughout American history, in every crisis, in every conflict, in every moment when the nation has had to decide what it actually stands for. And it is being asked today. The Loyalists are 300 years gone, but the question they represent is not gone at all. It is the oldest question in American politics, and we are still living with the answer we chose back in 1783. So here is what I want you to think about. Was there another way? Could the revolution have been fought? Could independence have been won without destroying the lives of 500,000 people who simply disagreed? Or is that the price that freedom always costs? Write it in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think. If this story moved you, shook you, or made you see the American founding in a completely different light, then subscribe to Cradle of Democracy. Because this is what we do here. We do not give you the textbook version. We give you the version that actually happened, with all its complexity, all its darkness, and all its humanity. And if you want more, check out our video on the Articles of Confederation, the document that nearly destroyed the Republic before it had a chance to prove the Loyalists wrong. Because that story is just as wild and just as important. See you there.